us today. My name is Denise Blair, and I'm the Director of Education at the Michigan State University Museum. And today we have a wonderful event planned for you related to our upcoming exhibit called Beyond the Black Panther, Visions of Afrofuturism in American Comics, which will be opening hopefully very soon as a virtual exhibit. So you'll hear a lot about that today and hopefully be able to visit that exhibit soon in its virtual format. Today's talk is entitled The Secret Comic Origins of Afrofuturism. And we have Dr. Julian Chambliss, who is the curator of the exhibit, with us today. He will discuss Afrofuturist symbolism connected to Black Panther in comics and film, and discuss how the upcoming exhibit builds on the definition of Afrofuturism articulated in the 1990s. So just to say a little bit about Julian, Dr. Julian C. Chambliss is the Val Berryman Curator of History at the Michigan State University Museum and Professor of English with a joint appointment in history at MSU. Additionally, he is a core participant in the MSU College of Arts and Letters CEDAR, the Consortium for Critical Diversity in the Digital Age Research. His research interests focus on the race, identity, and power in real and imagined urban spaces. He's an interdisciplinary scholar who has designed museum exhibits, curated art shows, and created public digital history projects that trace community, identity, and power in the American South. So he will take questions at the end of the presentation. And then at the very end, we have a poll that we'd like you to take, giving us your feedback on the program. So we'll put that up at the very end. So thank you so much for being here. And Julian, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Denise. Thanks for all your hard work setting up our educational and public outreach for the exhibit. I'm gonna share my screen. So I'm going to, hopefully you'll be able to see my slideshow here.
Yes, it's visible.
Thank you.
And just as also a reminder, we are recording the program today, just so participants that you're aware of that.
Yeah, so this is a great opportunity for me. I really appreciate those of you who take time out of your day for a little lunchtime talk, as I'm going to be doing several of these related to the exhibition that should be opening in the next week or so. This one is going to focus on the sort of secret origins, comic origins of Afrofuturism. And what I want to try to do is talk a little about the motivations here. So I'm going to start with the obvious question of what is Afrofuturism. The images you see on the screen are actually some images that you would see if you sort of just Googled the term Afrofuturism. Now, part of the challenge, I think, for all of us is when we think about Afrofuturism, we think about it in the context of a sort of current moment, which has really been transformed in part by the success in 2018 of the Black Panther film, Marvel's Black Panther, which really is building on a long legacy of that character in Marvel Comics. And I'll talk a bit more about that character as an example of Afrofuturism later on. But for a lot of people, when you say Afrofuturism, the imagery that they saw on the screen during this film really, in trying to process it, they process it as Afrofuturist. And in that context, it really sort of speaks to a kind of classical understanding of like a kind of future-oriented narrative about Black people, detached at some level from expectations, sort of carved and created through a kind of Eurocentric lens. But of course, when we think about Afrofuturism from a definitional standpoint, there's a really sort of direct way that we can sort of map it out. It's a framework, and the actual term itself is coined by Mark Derry, a cultural theorist in the 1990s. And I always like to talk about the sort of origin point of Afrofuturism, the term, because Derry was doing it in the context of a book called Black to the Future, an essay called Black to the Future. And he had a premise that he was working with. This was actually a series of interviews that he was conducting with Samuel R. Delany, a very famous Black grandmaster in science fiction. Greg Tate, also a very famous writer of hip hop, and Trisha Rose, a cultural historian who writes about hip hop. And as part of the lead in to this series of conversation with these noted Black thinkers and scholars and writers, he wanted to know why, in his mind, Black people did not engage more directly with science fiction. And this quote, which is sort of pulled from a PDF of the actual article, um, he makes the point that, in his mind at least, Black people don't engage with science fiction, and this is really perplexing. And he makes a really strong sort of parallel sort of analysis of like the experience of Black people and the experience of aliens and how they're so very similar. And you can see it here, very real sense. Black people are descendants of alien abductees. They inhabit a sci-fi nightmare where unseen forces frustrate their movements. Official histories undo their accomplishment. Technology is branded, used to brought to bear on their bodies, branding, forced sterilization, all of which are true. Everything he says here is true, and this is a very insightful statement. And we should always, I always want to make sure that I make clear that the very strong sort of critical comparison he's making here between the sort of like subject nature of Blackness and the alienation um, uh, represented by the Black experience does in fact correspond. And so for him, trying to think past that structure, he comes up with a definition of what we understand to be Afrofuturism. He just sort of defines, he says, speculative fiction that treats African-American themes and addresses African-American concerns in the context of 20th century technoculture, and more generally, African-American signification that appropriates images of technology and a prosthetically enhanced future might, for want of a better term, be called Afrofuturism. This little turn of phrase, of course, points very directly to some of the imagery that we think about when we look at Black Panther, because it's a future-oriented phraseology, right? So it's a images of technology, prosthetically enhanced, so like cyborgs, like the grafting of technology onto Black bodies, so on and so forth. These are the things that represent Afrofuturism in this original sort of framing. But in fact, Afrofuturism can be thought of another way as well. And one of the things that happens almost immediately after the term is coined is that many Black thinkers and scholars like Alondra Nelson start to think about what this term that he's coined really describes a kind of Black speculative practice. And Nelson in particular is working on a kind of online forum in the late 1990s called Afrofuturist Net, where lots of scholars, artists, practitioners of what we call Afrofuturism are talking about this thing that this term Afrofuturism is identifying as a Black practice, right? And for Nelson, she says, well, Afrofuturism is really a kind of epistemology. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of looking. She thinks about it as a way to understand Black diasporic artistic production. She thinks about it as a way to understand this relationship of the subject nature of Black people and the Black experience. And it's also a kind of aspiration of Black vision of modernity, right? Like when we think about modernity, it's crafted and understood and really projected and manufactured through this lens of a kind of Eurocentric project, right? And does it have to be? No, it doesn't. There could be another framework, and that other framework offers different pathways. So an Afrofuturist framework doesn't necessarily have to be oriented towards the past. And I always like to point out that one of the things that drew me to Afrofuturism was comics, but I also think that in thinking about these sort of imagined landscapes around Blackness, that you can see there's often a way that you can recover sort of past innovation, past knowledge, that there's an element here of like a future-oriented Afrofuturism that is also deeply engaged with the past. That in fact, the present, the past, and the future are in dialogue in the context of Afrofuturism. This is very important. There is a recovery of past innovation that's important to our vision of the future. And so when we think about Afrofuturism, yes, there are these future-oriented narratives there, but in fact, there's something more complicated in terms of like recovering, reimagining how we think about the future and the past. And City Imagined, this was an effort to sort of bring together documents that thought about and presented some snapshots of Black innovation and Black thought about visioning the future that stretch all the way back into previous periods that you might not necessarily have thought about. An example of this would be thinking of a place like Eatonville, Florida, or thinking about someone like Booker T. Washington. Both both of which are different contexts where Black people are imagining a future. Eatonville is the first incorporated Black municipality in the United States. And if you think about that, that is an effort on the part of Black people who are doing this in the 1890s, with what many historians refer to as the nadir. They're imagining a future space. They're creating a space that's going to nurture them, protect them, provide safety in an incredibly hostile environment, right? Booker T. Washington really wanted to create a kind of philosophy, a system, a way of thinking and doing with his industrial education that armored Black people to survive this hostile nature of Jim Crow segregation. And he created a kind of refuge space, Tuskegee University, a kind of complete system to train Black people to be able to sustain themselves, right? Yes, he's often criticized for his acceptance, I use air quotes here, of segregation, but he also is very clear he's doing that as a stopgap to provide, to give Black people a chance to build their capacity to press forward at a later date and achieve the full fruits of citizenship. So when we think about, Zora Neale Hurston, she too is an Afrofuturist. And one of the things that Hurston was really key in her mind is that, there's legitimate Black knowledge that does not need to be diluted. This is one of the things that made her a sort of like standout figure during the Harlem Renaissance. She was very much devoted to the idea that like legitimate Black knowledge was something that represented a contribution to the Black experience. She does this in her academic work. She does this in her creative work, right? She celebrates Black contributions to culture. So in this way, she is thinking about a kind of Black epistemology and a way of seeing, a way of doing as being equal to and contributing to modernity. So when we think about this in the context of comics, I often think about comics as a critical geography where we can mine and understand that they represent an archive of the American experience. And with Afrofuturism, this question, another question that Derry offers up in the context of creating a definition is, can Black people sort of embrace the future, right? If your past is so deliberately caught up and your contemporary energies are always dedicated to trying to right the wrongs of the past, what does an imagined possible future look like for Black people? And this is interesting because in that same moment of definition, one of the things that Derry points out is that at the time that he was writing in 1993, 94, there was actually this huge renaissance in terms of Black comics. And he actually points to comics as well as hip hop in the definitional document, like in that document where he defines Afrofuturism in that essay. He says, like, hip hop is an example of Afrofuturist practice, but he also says comics. He says Afrofuturism percolates through the Black written, Black drawn comics. And in conceiving of the idea of this exhibit, which originally started out as a conversation about Black invention, and as we were talking about it within the museum, I was going to use comics that featured Black inventors as the focal point. But then I really started to rethink and came back to this quote and really thought about Afrofuturism percolates through Black written, Black drawn comics. And Milestone Comics, which is the comic book company that he's referring to in that quote, the leading light of that in many ways, the one that sort of celebrated, the creator celebrated most, who passed away, is Dwayne McDuffie. And he was always very clear that Milestone wasn't, quote unquote, a Black comic book company. It was a comic book company that wanted to show the diversity and scope and complexity of the world that Black people knew existed. Like, it wasn't just the sort of like white world that in fact sort of defined comics in the mainstream, but he wanted to show a kind of more complete vision of the world. And I think this is one of the things about comics in the context of Afrofuturism that's really important. It's not just simply that the comics themselves feature Black characters. That is one element of it that I wanted to bring to bear when thinking about the show. But I also want to bring to bear the incredible scope and diversity represented by Black speculative practice. And I think that's one of the things that unites some of the works that we have in the show. So science fiction and social justice can play themselves out in comics and in context of Milestone. Again, what happens if you rethink the Superman narrative through an African American lens? Well, Superman is in some ways a classic superhero narrative, right? This is the first superhero. But let's pause and really think about that. I want to show you a little bit of a clip from the Fleischer cartoons that were created in the 1940s based on those original Superman stories.
In the endless reaches of the universe, there once existed a planet known as Krypton, a planet that burned like a green star in the distant heavens. There, civilization was far advanced and had brought forth a race of supermen whose mental and physical powers were developed to the absolute peak of human perfection. But there came a day when giant quakes threatened to destroy Krypton forever. One of the planet's leading scientists, sensing the approach of doom, placed his infant son in a small rocket ship and sent it hurtling in the direction of the Earth just as Krypton exploded. The rocket ship sped through star-studded space, landing safely on Earth with its precious burden, Krypton's sole survivor. A passing motorist found the uninjured child and took it to an orphanage. As the years went by and the child grew to maturity, he found himself possessed of amazing physical powers. Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the man of steel, Superman.
So we all know the story of Superman, but I often like to pause in class to really get students to think through this narrative. Yes, this is a story created by two second-generation Jewish American immigrants. It tells the story of a immigrant who comes to the United States, who's raised in the heartland, who actually at some level takes his innate immigrant traits, right? Like his sort of like, his heritage, his sort of biological heritage, and marries it with some philosophy of the United States to become a Superman, but also really a super citizen, right? Like someone who you could depend on and who sort of maintains the status quo. We're often critical, I think, of superhero characters because of their almost authoritarian nature, especially superhero characters. But this is a character that's really stemming from a very particular moment in American mindset, as many superhero characters at the dawn of superhero era in the late 30s and early 40s are. They're nationalistic, but that nationalism is really tempered by a kind of progressive liberal politics that's framed by the New Deal, as many comic book scholars will talk about. And so the power of Superman is also, at some level, can be understood at that moment as a power of every man, right? A kind of community power that's personified by this sort of white immigrant who has imbibed all the values of the United States. And he's a status quo hero because at that moment, that status quo is dedicated to the common man. But what does it mean to tell that story if you're doing it through the context of a Black person? So one of the things about Icon as a character, as a Black comic book character, is it takes many of the same premises that you have a character who is an alien, August Freeman IV, who is an alien who crashes on Earth when his ship goes down. So I mostly want to make the comparison here between sort of like a kind of white Superman character and the expectations around culture and power associated with that character, which we all know, versus Icon, where in the first issue, when he shows up having been convinced by his teenage sidekick Rocket to be a superhero, the police do not welcome him as a figure of stability, right? They actually, as you can see from this frame, the first issue of Icon ends with the police going, click, 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 click. They're about to shoot him, which at some level speaks to these expectations around race and power that we can associate with the imaginary, right? For a Black writer and Black artist that were telling the story in Milestone Comics, the premise of a superpowered character of color does not guarantee acceptance by the mainstream, right? So that often leads to this moment of like, well, so what? Why is this important? Well, the reason is that when we think about Black characters and Black visual narratives, we think about Afrofuturism, I think we can associate it with something called a future industry. And in particular, I think we can think about it in Afrofuturism in general as being part of what I like to think of as a Black future industry. And we're using the show, or I'm using the show to sort of think about the museum space as an incubator for recovery of this Black future industry. So what you see when you go to the show, the images, the comics that you're seeing there are giving you a hint of the scope of the Black imaginary, which is the intersection between the speculative and the liberatory when Black creators are given an opportunity to tell their story. So there's a lot of variety in the imagery that you're seeing from Black created comics that are going to be in the show. And these visions represent very particular critiques and moments of intersection of speculation articulated by people of color across time and across space. And so each one of these images here, and these are all from comics that are in the show, they play at different elements that we might associate with the comic genre, be it more general superhero, but also really tight historical moments of reflection and social critique, right? The dangers posed by police violence, for instance, or the sort of transformative power of technology in the context, in the hands of Black people. So these are all elements that we find in these comics. Probably most important early theorist about Afrofuturism said that in a piece in Centennial Review, which is actually a journal based here at MSU, when he was doing some further reflection on Afrofuturism after his sort of groundbreaking work, More Brilliant Than the Sun, he talked about that there exists in society a future industry that is created by an intersection of various kinds of like cultural narratives, right? So techno-science, fictional media, technological projection, market prediction. These are all things that exist in our world. We are exposed to them in a constant fashion, but they intersect to create a future industry. They're the way that we understand and try to predict the future, because in fact, the prediction of the future is really rooted in the contemporary moment, which is in fact connected to a managed past, right? So there's an element here of every prediction of the future being in service, if we want to be critical, of maintaining a status quo. How do you project a kind of stability from a current moment, if you're the people in power, to a future moment where things are better and you're still in power? And so a Black future industry seeks to disrupt that pattern of replication, disrupt that pattern of what many people would argue is subjugation, and try to think of a more liberatory framework. So a Black future industry would take all of these same spaces, but recover them at some level and offer up a different pathway. So fictional media is going to imagine freedom when we think about it from the Black context. Technological projection is going to sort of like think about education and uplift and inventiveness from a Black perspective. Market predictions are going to think about ways that we reallocate and rethink and rebalance resources from the diaspora. Even something like techno-science, the way that science and culture are understood and intersect, it can be imagined in a different way. And all this together becomes a kind of Black future industry. So comics have a place in this, because if we can find that Black future industry, comic narratives like the ones that we see in Beyond the Black Panther are really sort of building blocks of that, a huge part of that, that sort of future industry that's more liberatory, more speculative, and thinks about the subject position of Black people and modernity in a different way. So this is an example of one of the comics that is in the show. This is All Negro Comics, a comic that's the first sort of Black produced comic ever produced in the United States, a comic book. This is 1947. This is produced by Orrin Evans, who got his start in Philadelphia as a newspaper reporter. They only produced one issue of all Negro comics. And when thinking about possible comics for the show, I thought it was very important to have this comic in because it's an anthology comic. So when you see the front cover of all Negro comics, there are multiple characters sort of represented on that cover. Each one of them have a story in the comic. It also includes short prose pieces, very similar to many other anthology comics that you would find on the newsstand in the 1940s. In this particular comic, there's a character called Lion Man, which scholars like Blair Davis have argued is a proto Black Panther. This is a character that appeared in print before Black Panther. And as you can see in the close-up of the sort of description, of the sort of foreword, an American-born, college-educated Lion Man is a young scientist sent by the United Nations to watch over a magic mountain on Africa's Gold Coast. It's uranium, and he's there to protect it from enemies of freedom. Now, on the surface, this is an adventure story like any other, but to think of this in the context of a kind of Black political landscape, right, both real and imagined, it becomes more complicated because 1947 is a pivotal year. This is actually also the year that the NAACP submitted to the United Nations an appeal to the world, a statement about the denial of human rights to minorities in the United States, a document that called on the UN to do something to protect African Americans from the oppressive, regressive nature of Jim Crow segregation. So a newspaper reporter from Philadelphia is creating a comic book with a character called Lion Man who is operating under the aegis of the United Nations. Is this an intersection where the sort of geopolitics of a kind of progressive, liberatory Black politics are playing themselves out in the pages of a comic book? I think we have to take that into account for the audience that is absorbing this story and for us to think about the full potential of the speculative and the imaginative as a part of a kind of counter narrative, a Black counter public that resists the negative influences of Jim Crow segregation. In the show, one of the things that we have related to that original Lion Man is the work of John Jennings, who is a professor and artist from the University of California, Riverside. Jennings reimagines all Negro comics Lion Man character as an ongoing series, as a kind of speculative project. And what you'll see when you go to the show is that he's imagined different covers of the Lion Man ongoing series, stretching back similar to like Superman from the 1940s all the way to sort of modern era. So this is Lion Man 50, which is sort of like taking on some of the elements of sort of comic tropes of that period. And here again, you can see a kind of recovery effort on the part of a Black creator reaching into the visual cultural past of African Americans to imagine the full implications and full potential associated with that character. Of course, one of the things that defines Afrofuturism is Marvel Comics and an age of Marvel Comics in the 1960s. 1960s in comics history and comic studies often referred to as the Silver Age. And again, it's always interesting to think that it is a creator like Jack Kirby, who is a child of immigrants who grew up in a multi-ethnic space that is New York City, who is going to create the sort of Marvel Cinematic Universe in collaboration with people like Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. The characters that we understand that really drive the Marvel Cinematic Universe today are characters all created by Jack Kirby. And Black Panther is a prime example of that. When we think about Black Panther as a character, he is a post-colonial statement that is in reaction to the rise of the civil rights movement. It's always important to recognize that this is a character that is coming after so many things that happened in relation to the civil rights movement in the United States. It's after the Voting Rights Act. It's after the Civil Rights Act. But it is the first superhero character who is Black, but he's not American. He is African. And in this context, this is a recognition on the part of Kirby and Lee that the sort of impact of imperialism the exploitation of Africa, what could have been if that had not have happened. Of course, the imagery we associate with Jack Kirby becomes the sort of like fertile ground that gets transformed and melded and expanded upon by subsequent generation of Black creators in the decades from the introduction in 1966 to get you to the character that you see on the screen in 2018. And it's important to recognize that it's not until the 1990s that Black people actually get a chance to write the Black Panther, let alone draw the Black Panther. And so there's a continuing effort of decolonization, as Rebecca Wanzo has described it, associated with the character. So the Black Panther that we see on the screen in 2018 is a Black Panther pulling from the sort of origin story that is post-colonial, but really taking on some of the political and social and economic critiques articulated by Black people who get to write the character in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and in the 2000s. So the landscape that Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes the Black Panther series in the most recently, is one of transformation. Like, he says that you can't overestimate the impact of seeing a Black character like this in the 1960s. But the heritage of that character as an intersection between speculation and liberation only increases as you have more and more Black people able to tell that story. Another example of a kind of recovery, transformation, innovation in the show is Octavia Butler's work. We have images from the comic book adaptation of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And of course, Butler is often lauded as the grandmother, as it were, or the founding mother of sort of modern science fiction, Afrofuturist writing. She is a science fiction writer that is often cited for her almost oracle-like ability to predict some of the contemporary challenges that we face today. And in particular, in Parable of the Sower, she has a political landscape that mirrors very much what we're living through right now, down to a political leader who has a slogan that says, "Make America Great Again." But in her work and in her writings about her work, she was always very clear. The things that drove her, the concerns that guided her work were around questions of hierarchy, around questions of oppression, and looking towards a vision of equity and protection, often guided by an African-American woman, that were central to seeing a path to a different world. And so in adapting her work into comics, what you see is some of the threads of liberation and speculation that I think are like inherent to a lot of Black comic book characters, taking on a kind of like prime foundational literary Afrofuturist work. And the results are a really compelling story and visual story and adaptation of that work. And again, this is a work by Damian Duffy and John Jennings, who previously adapted Butler's The Kindred story just last year for Abram Books. The landscape that I'm sort of like covering here and talking about the show is one that is very much rooted in a complex literature about Black speculative practice and liberation. And some of the books you see on the screen give you different pathways into that. A really great sort of general work that's really accessible is Ytasha Womack's Afrofuturism. It's a book I use in my own IH class on Afrofuturism. But speculative work or creative work like Mothership from Rosarium give you a sense of like some of the short fiction that's so crucial. But some of the academic work here too, Black and Brown Planets, Speculative Blackness, these are all works that are undergirding my thinking and approaching comics as a part of this sort of Black future industry. So what I hope to do in the context of the show is to sort of create a landscape where we have a better understanding of the complexity of Black speculative practice and the centrality of comics to that practice, and perhaps prime us to sort of look to Black comics not as a kind of sort of isolated industry, but in fact as a prime place where Black imagination and the Black imaginary are testing out ideas and grappling with the questions of the day. So I'm going to stop it there and handle questions if there are some.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Chambliss. That was really great. So interesting. Now, if you do have questions, there's the Q&A function in your toolbar. So please feel free to type your questions there, or if you have some issue with that and you can use the chat, you can use the chat window also.
All questions are answered. Whew.
You've done a fantastic job. No questions. Oh, okay. Here's one question. Jennifer asks, could you speak to the intersectionality?
Sure. I think one of the things about Afrofuturism is
Oh, sorry. She continues, intersectionality in specifically in feminism in Afrofuturism.
Right. One of the things about Afrofuturism is that it does rest on an emphasis on the protection and valuation of women, especially Black women. This is one of the sort of precepts that you can see in the comics that are in the show. It's very deliberate that Octavia Butler's adaptation is included, in part because the protection and leadership of Black women is an important part of how Afrofuturism operates as a kind of system, right? So the intersectionality here is important as creating a world where Black women are empowered and safe becomes a world where at some level everyone can be empowered and safe, which is, I think, a key tenet of how intersectionality challenges us to think about the intersecting nature of oppression. So this idea of gender oppression and racial oppression really being at some level a defining element of the Black female perspective means that in a world where Black characters and Black protagonists who are female are able to carve out space in the value statements that they offer in terms of like protecting community and championing equity are central. These become worlds where the full benefits of citizenship and the full benefits of a functional community can be realized, right? And so many of the characters that you see in the show are characters that take up this sort of twin responsibility or burden, if you want to put it to it, of female characters that are pushing against patriarchy while at the same time championing innovation or championing equity, working against the system. And so there's a natural affirmation in a lot of Afrofuturist narratives because of that. A decentering of patriarchy, a celebration of equity that often celebrates Black female characters, but also I think at some level celebrates just the end of heteronormity as a central defining system. It's, I think, at some level simplistic to say it's just simply about Black women, although the Black female protagonist is one of the things that helps define what Afrofuturism is, right? You can see it in Octavia Butler's work, you can see it in this comic work, and in fact, one of the categories that used to define the Afrofuturist framework is gender. And that's why when you see the show, there will be a section of comics that are in fact, I think, capturing this sort of like Black feminist intersectionality in the stories that they're telling. But they're telling very different stories, right? They're telling stories of, for instance, a Black female inventor in the late 19th century, or a kind of Black community organizer / protector of the 20th century, or as I said, they're adapting this classic work of Octavia Butler, which is actually set in a kind of right now. It's like a kind of early 2000. I forget the exact year that Parable of the Sower is set, but it's not like, it's not 1,000 years into the future. It's like right about now. So yeah, that's a key part of I think an Afrofuturist framework, and that's one of the factors that drives the inclusion of some of the comics in the show.
Okay, we have another question from Nick. What era are the icon comics you mentioned earlier? Interested
Those
to hear
comics,
where the narrative occurred versus the Superman narrative.
so the icon comics are comics actually from the 1990s. So they were on the newsstands at the same time that essay by Mark Derry was published, because in the actual article, as you might have noticed, that figure that you saw on the slide, that's from the article. That's Hardware, and there were 4 launch titles for Milestone Comics: Hardware, which is like Iron Man; Icon, who's like Superman; Blood Syndicate, which is sort of like a teen book, which is about a street gang; and then Static, which was like their version of Spider-Man. Static became probably the most famous of those characters because he got a cartoon that a lot of kids remember on the WB, right? And so Static became like a very popular character. But that was a 1990s character, whereas Superman, of course, as I indicated, was, this created the superhero genre. So that was a 1938 introduction, and still going strong to this very day across all media, right?
And an anonymous attendee asks, what are some of the cultural connections between Black Afrofuturist comics and Blaxploitation cinema of the 1970s?
So that's a really good question. I think one way that we can think about the link here is that both those Blaxploitation films and media and comics were reacting to an emerging emphasis on a kind of structural racism. And I'm always very careful when we think about Blaxploitation, because Blaxploitation is rooted in the rise of Black power, right? Like that's at some level the cultural milieu that gets you Blaxploitation as African Americans who have been very active in the streets in terms of social justice work in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, which was understood by white people to be an assimilationist model, meaning they wanted to do stuff that white people could do, like eat at a lunch counter, which lots of white people, that wasn't unreasonable. Even though Jim Crow segregation made it seem unreasonable. Like, it was not unreasonable to want to drink a water fountain, eat at a lunch counter. By the time you get to the end of that era in the late 60s, 67, 68, 69, you have more and more structural critiques being articulated by African-American leaders like Martin Luther King. And the articulation of the word Black power becomes married to this critique of structural racism, which, unlike the sort of like de jure, right? Like when you can sort of look at it, like you can't go in here, you can't drink from that. Whereas a kind of inherent practice that is invisible, that is suppressing and erasing and preventing, that becomes a much more complicated set of critiques that most white people are not able to understand, and a conservative backlash villainizes, right? But that critique of this sort of systemic nature of racism gives rise to, during Blaxploitation, a series of narratives where Black people do seize power, that they do act in the affirmative in the public space in opposition to institutions, to practices, in a way that does involve violence. Like, if you want to think about one thing that separates sort of aspirational reformist media of the 1960s from 1970s, is that the Black characters in the 1960s, they seem just like us and they're super nice. Think Sidney Poitier, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. In the 1970s, they are not like you and they don't have to be nice, right? Like they shaft a Black guy who does 3 things that have never been done prior to that moment in film by a Black person. He sleeps with a white woman with no negative consequences. He talks back to white people with no negative consequences. he fights with the police with literally no negative consequences. Like he does not die at the end of that film. Like all those things with a Black character killed in previous films, and he did all three in the same film, and he walked away alive. Like, not to mention Sweetback, right, which is like really probably the more classic film. So there's like a clear element of fighting against these sort of systemic expectations around Blackness and the subject nature of being Black in Black exploitation films. Now, many of these films are produced by white people who don't understand that, right? And so I'm always really careful about this. Like, there's a lot of positives in that transformation from the standpoint of like Black people not being allowed to do something prior to that moment. So a character like Luke Cage, which is basically the Black exploitation comic book character, if you read that comic when it debuts in the 1970s, there is a huge, it debuts in 1970. There is a huge element of social commentary in that comic. Luke Cage is wrongfully convicted. Many Black people are wrongfully convicted. He was abused in prison. Black people were abused in prison. He was experimented on in prison. That's how he got his powers. Black people were experimented on in the context of prisons and in many, many contexts, right? So there are a lot of benchmarks that we can associate with like a kind of critique, but it also is this, diamond heart skinned, super masculine character that sort of like buck kind of character fits within a framework that increasingly a kind of white media is willing to put Black characters into, be male or female, right? Like Coffee or so on and so forth. So there's a complicated intersection around speculation and liberation represented by Black exploitation, but some of the purveyors of Black exploitation are white people who don't quite get all of it. I mean, I think we always need to make a distinction between, especially some of the earlier Black exploitation work that is at some level very critical in providing a kind of reflective narrative that captures that, versus later work, which I think sort of cashes in on the tropes associated with Black exploitation.
Okay, another question from Terrence. Dwayne McDuffie, a native of our state, spent his high school years in Roper School, which geared toward high achievers. What role do you think education, K-12, post-secondary, etc., will play in cultivating future Afrofuturism talent?
I think that's a really important element and space for encouraging transformative thought. I think one of the challenges that we have is that education, at least how it's sort of come into being in a contemporary moment, doesn't necessarily provide the space for kids to be speculative and sort of like think in a certain way. I mean, I do think that the emphasis on teaching the test or Common Core can be quite difficult for educators to carve out the space to cultivate the kind of creative vision that is necessary to encourage people to be problem solvers and things like that. But I think for African Americans, education as a tool for liberation is a recurring theme, and it comes up in Afrofuturism all the time. I mean, that's why I do point to someone like Booker T. Washington, who is a problematic figure in a broad swath of sort of Black political and social commentary in the late 19th, early 20th century. But one of the things that he did is he creates an educational structure that is designed to give Black people tools to be independent. We can argue about the nature of industrial education, but in practice, most industrial education, most normal and industrial schools that graduates of Tuskegee Institute actually teach at, they actually integrate both a kind of industrial education and a classical education together. So meaning that they teach people things like bricklaying, but they also teach them things like Latin, and like they make them read and so on and so forth, right? Like, so the idea that education will be transformative, that education will be a tool, that the 21st century landscape has to incorporate a kind of technical, creative, critical thinking education. I think those are really important conversations to have. I mean, I personally think it's very important to think about critical thinking and problem solving, like project-based assignments in the context of my own class is something I'm always trying to like refine and think about. And I think that especially in the context of an information economy of the 21st century is very important for people of color, right? This is one of the things that our contemporary political landscape is failing to clearly articulate to every American, let alone to people of color. That is that you're living in an information economy. What are the tools? What are the varieties of tools and skill sets that you will need in order to be successful in that information economy? And a lot of it's about problem solving. A lot of it is about learning how to learn. A lot of it is about creating a pathway to deal with projects in a way that allows for flexible thinking and problem solving to come together, like, a kind of synthetic kind of thinking. And I think those are really important conversations that our colleagues in education talk about a lot. This emphasis on STEAM, where you're integrating the arts into a more traditional education is important. And I think ultimately a consideration of liberal arts in the context of your educational experience, those are also really important. So yeah, I think that's a vital part of this story, and we'll see how those things play themselves out. I mean, these are going to be really vital conversations to have as we think about education in the 21st century, especially in the next few years. I mean, there are really sort of pivotal questions related to climate and technology and things like that.
Okay, well, we have a few more questions, but I don't think we'll be able to get to all of those. Would you be willing to accept questions via email if people wanted to follow up with you about the discussion today?
Sure, if you send me an email, I will get to it. I can't tell you when I'll get to it, but I'll try to get to it.
Okay, all right. So, and Julian's contact information is available on the MSU website. If you just go to msu.edu and type in his name, you'll see his contact information and be able to read more about all the wonderful work that he is doing. So again, we thank you so much for this talk. It was really informative, and appreciate you taking time to share this work with us today. And looking forward to the opening of the exhibition. We'll see you there soon. And again, everyone, thanks again for coming. Hopefully come visit us at the museum. And I will open up the poll now. If you have a couple of seconds just to give us a little feedback, we'd really appreciate that. So see you again. Have a wonderful afternoon.